Hello, Daniel.
How are you? Oh, we had the same idea. We both went
I'm thinking
outside.
of your opening story of the strawberry bed, or the bed that could be for strawberries and now has strawberries. And the use of the word perennial goes from being a Platonic abstraction, that which endures in and beyond time, to no, we can look forward to in time, in advance, successive years of the strawberries yield because of this bed, because of this structure. And so we find that structure as the par excellence, what do you want to call it, form of bringing heaven and earth together, of bringing abstraction and concrete things into meaningful relations that hold. A structure does more than give us stories of convention or conventional stories. And that to me is something. Because I've been thinking about syntax, and it's how syntax cuts across the domains and disciplines of human endeavor, right? You can look at syntax from a linguistic point of view, or you can look at syntax just by its etymology with syn, taxis, or order. So if we begin with an order and look for orderings, then our question does not simply become, what is my starting point and point of departure, but rather, from what ordering am I discover new orderings, and how are those coordinated? And we're talking about many to many here, not one to one. So even our language of relation, which some people could cast in the parlance of function, is different because we're talking about groups. I mean, the structure of that strawberry bed is full of parts, housing this thing that is full of parts, the strawberry yield. And the union of those two wholes, WHOLE, that has parts, also changes the way we have a perspective on time with our surrounding area, which also is a whole full of parts. And as Aristotle would say, using our privileged part of eyesight as metaphor for the future, looking forward to. So what I guess I'm opening opening to you for your thoughts uh, is, and situating it with your opening story of the strawberry structure. What do we make of this being in the world with all these whole part relationships? Because if it's anything, it's not static.
Well, first, I always look forward to speaking to you. So thank you for your time this evening, my friend. It's
Likewise.
always a delight. The first thing that just kind of struck me is it's very funny that when we think of eternity, we don't think of perennial, but why not? Right? Like if theoretically, if something perennial came back at the same time every year, would that make it less eternal than something that was constant every moment of every possible second? It's interesting that we don't tend to naturally associate something as eternal if it comes and goes, comes and goes. But if it theoretically came and go, went forever, and of course the strawberry's not technically gone, as in gone to nothing. It's actually just in a different manifestation. It's dormant in the winter. It's coming forth in a different way. So there's a way in which what is perennial is, you could say, eternal, per theoretically, of course. Um, but it changes how it manifests at different seasons. And it's just very interesting that that is a very valid category of temporality that we don't tend to associate with eternity. We have a kind of tendency to think of eternity as constant in a single manifestation of every possible moment. So, but must that follow? Must a thing be constantly of a single manifestation at all possible moments to be eternal, or can it change in its manifestation and still be called eternal? Right? Um, Well, I mean, obviously, there's something to be said about the Trinity, where the way God manifests on earth by different persons in no way whatsoever suggests that there's time where God's not present with man. It's just according to different manifestations, right? And it is interesting to think of how perhaps often the distinction between order, chaos, structure, freedom is simply biasing a form of manifestation of which has to be one thing at all times or it's not the thing. Like if order ever becomes more spontaneous, we say, well, that wasn't order. Or if we say something spontaneous becomes order, we say, well, that wasn't spontaneous. When in fact, what we see in nature is a blending of those categories that go together. So the first thing I suppose that comes to mind is that when we think about order, or something that's constant, we already have a kind of bias in the back of our minds on what that would mean. It's not based on more vegetative metaphors. It's based on notions of a lack of contingency, like it's not contingent. It is always present. We have a bias toward a notion of presence, like something is eternal if it is always present, right? But again, you know, you could say Jesus goes away, but he gives us the Holy Spirit. So he goes, but he's present in a different way, right? In the same way that strawberries go, but they're present in a different way as they're dormant. So it is interesting too to think about perhaps one of the things that has gotten us in trouble with language is when we kind of do the meta move, and these are just opening thoughts, but I appreciate what you were saying. When we do the meta move of talking about language, we tend to have metaphors that are buildings, like there are building blocks that we build upon one another. We don't think about vegetables. We don't think about strawberry metaphors by which to think about language, right? We don't think about root systems that, you know, and of course, there's always something very interesting. You know, Austin Farrer made this point where he said, you know, the difference between, there are many weeds that look like flowers. The difference between a weed and a flower is that you wanted it or not, the design, right? The ordering, right? So what's actually very interesting about that is that not only does the design afford possibility, it determines definition. If you define this thing as a weed or not, actually can be like the ordering goes to the very way that you're toward the thing, right? Like how you approach it, right? And it's interesting to think of the way that you're towards something that's perennial is a strawberry changes with the seasons, right? We kind of say that it's dead or that it's gone just kind of relative to how it makes us feel when we approach it. And there's something about how language is greatly kind of affected in our understanding of what it is by one, the mood we're in, by the season that we're in, by the metaphors that we have, and perhaps on the topic of syntax, using more vegetative metaphors. I know Matt Segal will talk about that. More vegetative metaphors can be very useful. I've actually, it's funny this comes up because on a slightly related note, I've been speaking with Thomas Jockin on the Deleuzian rhizome and comparing it with the catagen or Aristotelian, or you could say Thomistic question of the root. And the root, and it is very interesting to think of language with that question, because the root is basically what Catagen would say is the quote unquote fifth that makes analogical reasoning possible. Like when I say, for example, that person is healthy, that fish is healthy, and that light is healthy. What do you mean a light is healthy? Right? And yet it's a meaningful concept because it's green, it's shining, it's working. So when I say that light is healthy, then it makes sense. But how does it make sense? That's the notion of the anagon. The anagon is the analogical principle, if you want to use that language. But then you can even make a distinction between principle and root, because when you try to get down in the weeds, to keep the metaphor going, when you try to get down into the weeds of what exactly is happening in analogical reasoning, it becomes very, very tricky because what makes the phrase that light is healthy intelligible, right? It is something that you grasped from the concept of health that you can apply to technology, and yet technology doesn't have organs. So what are we doing, right? So the anagon is what makes the phrase "the machine is healthy" intelligible, right? That's how that phrase is intelligible, but it's really hard to say what the anagon is, yet you grasp it, you sense it, you apprehend it, right? And so what Catagen wants to suggest is there has to be some sort of root to being that makes it possible to make things that have nothing to do with one another help us understand one another. Kind of, and yet that root, here's the tricky move, it's not a univocal singular being. It's a relationship that allows difference, but that root makes all the difference intelligible in light of the difference. I can make machines intelligible in light of the human body. I can make lights intelligible based on my understanding of health. And what's interesting is the rhizome for Deleuze is this kind of network by which all things are connected, kind of like rhizomatic roots, that he's trying to make space for difference to avoid government control. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But what's also very interesting is how when I think about syntax and like what we're building with language, you're putting things together to suddenly have this moment of anagon, moment of apprehension. Because then you could also, like following Sander and Hofstadter, say that all language is always already analogical. Like that's actually what we're always doing all the time, right? And you're getting this grasp of things. And so when something becomes intelligible to you, there's this moment of grasping it. And it's as if you've kind of constructed something to allow the thing to manifest to you in a new way. And I guess the question, the last point that I'll say is in the same way that the strawberry, we have a bias to not think of it as eternal because it's perennial, because it comes and goes and it comes and goes. And yet that coming and going is always in happening. So it's always present. So it becomes kind of a foundation. Similarly, the anagon comes and goes in language. We apprehend something, and then it goes away, and then it apprehended and goes away. We don't tend to associate that with eternity because it's not constant, but actually it's always kind of wooing you. There's always this kind of reliable possible experience of a grasping of intelligibility that is pulling you along, that's bringing you to the next season. Just like if you create the conditions, you can rely on the strawberries coming back again. Likewise, if you create the conditions of language, there's always this possibility of an intelligibility that can come back and pull you along in a new way and pull you along in a new way. And to me, it is interesting to think that as a movement of eternity in its coming and going, that coming and going can actually define how eternity moves, which sometimes we don't think because we have this kind of tendency that eternity has to be constant in order to be itself. But the strawberries have an eternity to them in their perennialness. So those were just thoughts I was having as you were speaking. I have been thinking a lot about the root and rhizome stuff with Jockin, but I'm also just very interested by why is it that we don't tend to associate perennial with a potential quality of eternity? It's interesting as I was thinking that, but.
And indeed, with the use of the word quality, I was looking through a few pages of Husserl's ideas on a lunch break, and as with Husserl, or as perhaps with phenomenology in general, you read a sentence and then you want to put the book down and look outside and see what shows up, or how what already has been there shows up anew. But then you have this little moment where you say, is it there, or am I putting it there? Or is what is there now the I looking back at me because I am performing some self-reflective judgment that I am aware of now through this, what? I mean, gloss it with phenomenological reduction, but did I really? It's so easy to think because I'm looking through a window, I've bracketed a piece of reality and put it in a frame. But the window did that. Maybe my mind did not. And so even in something like the phenomenological reduction, I think we can see a chunk of rhizome to what you're saying, because if we want the government to stay out of our business, not all business, keep the speed limits, keep the interstate highway, let's research possible pathogens so we don't have that in our water, etc. But things like personal liberty, please let me explore and discover through my own lights, healthy or unhealthy or coming to be healthy as they are, in a community that isn't governmental in nature. Okay. But it seems to me a move, this phenomenology, to just say, well, the cogito is the radically free libertarian who's on the frontier learning how to use his tools anew of aesthetic apprehension. And therefore the axe becomes this shining brightness out of the cave of whatever the government taught us through K through 12 or whatever, however we want to phrase it. So I don't know if phenomenology is the way to a clarified seeing of temporality or perennial disruption of the temporal. I don't know if phenomenology is going to take us to a privileged access that any sort of tyranny might put all its resources into barring us from. So I guess what I'm thinking out loud about is how Kant and Heidegger and Husserl and this tradition of being concerned with judgment, with apprehending phenomena, grasping the light emitting source and saying, there it is, the light, the special effect. I found it as a special effect. Yes, I have original datum, original data now. I can see behind the mag light and see that it's just like a blunt object. Before it was just making me close my eyes because I was looking at the flashlight side, but I've turned it around. I don't buy that narrative. It doesn't seem as compelling anymore to be so concerned with the subject making judgments and therefore having much ado about cognition, being that thing underneath inside the cylinder of the flashlight where somehow the battery has electricity and there's some chemical reaction that takes it from this little capsule into this emitting rays of light. And so people become concerned with neuroscience. I don't know. I don't find that story of there was darkness, but somewhere along the way in the tube, there's this mechanism called cognition that gets us to something like an emission of light that opens out onto a circumference called my apprehension of the world. I don't think one can live with the other in those terms. I don't think there's time. This might be a Kierkegaardian assertion. In such a worldview, there is no time for kenosis, for a self emptying to the other's demands, wishes, wants, needs. How can I give to the poor or be the poor given that something is given to if I'm always on the way to discovering what's underneath the hood, what's underneath the hood, what's underneath the hood, what's underneath the hood? It becomes an infinite regress, this mechanism, and this mechanistic outlook that never reaches an end. And I think you see a little bit, and then I'll be done, a little bit of this hinted in technical linguistic research when they say, and I at least think I've had the sensation of this, you look at a sentence and the grammar pops out at you as if you were to look at an animal and all its bones somehow come out of its skin. No harm's done to the animal, but you see all the bones and exoskeleton and whoa, the structure of this thing. And then it goes back into the animal and you say, oh, it's fluffy and it's nice. And you want to give it water and dog food. But then the bones come out again and you say, whoa, what a structure. I'd never think of feeding this structure. It's just a structure. But then it goes back. So you look at a sentence and you say, wait a minute, I could replace all those words with a different word, but yeah. So you look at a sentence, maybe a question, why did the chicken cross the road? And the structure of it comes out to you. And you don't see a chicken, you don't see a road, you don't see a question mark. And then it comes back and you see this visual of a chicken crossing the road and some kind of quandary and perplexity and an eyebrow raising. And then you come back and you see the structure and you go back in and out. And you notice at that moment, I could replace all these words and still have a question. So the rule, which is to say, you can replace all the words, but you can't just you can't put them in any order, and you can't just make them anything and call it intelligible. So there is some constraint, some hemming in, some understanding of the fact that, yes, the mag light will open light, but it's still going to be a circle. It's not going to be a shapeless void of penetrating insight. So you look at a sentence and the structure jumps out to you. You go back and you see the content. The structure jumps out to you. You go back and you see the content. And then you notice, I could replace all these words, change the content, but have the same structure. Right? The rules of grammar would be obeyed, even with different content. That leads one to say there's an infinite number, or just an uncountable number for Matthew Allison, of sentences that could be written which obey these rules. You could say an infinite number of worlds that could be lived and experiences that could be had, and phenomenological reductions to be exercised by the subject having a cognition. But what it doesn't give you is any experience of those worlds or access to those streets that a chicken would cross. It doesn't give you anything except an infinite regress. It doesn't give you anything except a structure. And that insight is at once wealth and poverty. And it beckons us to live, to seek the other, to which we can empty ourselves and find not answers, but a response, which is quite different than an answer. It has a different impulse to it. It has different demands. And that to me involves nothing of this language of subject, cognition, even certainty. It doesn't involve those heuristics.
Outstanding. So there's a few things, very important. So Derrida made the point where he said, his whole idea is basically critiquing metaphysics and ergo thinking then, because metaphysics being just kind of the foundations of the possibility of thought, how we reference physics, metaphysics, the way by which we reference physics, the categories, etc., that basically any metaphysics based on presence would fail because of an eternal regress problem. Basically what you were saying, except, he'll base it on the fact that a signifier can never be the signified. You always get the difference. If you try to make present what a thing is in language, then you have to define all the words in the sentences and all the words in those sentences and all the words in those sentences, and it goes on, right? So you never can make something present via signification. He believed phenomenology fell into the same thing, because what else was phenomenology but an effort to make presence the conditions of possibility by which the phenomenon manifest as themselves, right? And furthermore, often on the notion of bracketing the phenomenon, because if I were to say how I understand phenomenology, just very, very generally, there's a sort of idea, because Husserl was kind of famous for apparently studying like a mailbox in his class. He brought a mailbox to his class and they studied for an entire semester. There's this kind of idea of, well, if the mailbox manifests to me as gray, even though I might not ever be able to cross the numinal or something like that, what must the nature of reality be like so that I experience the mailbox as gray? Like, what are the conditions of possibility that make the mailbox manifest as gray versus blue, right? And so there's that idea that even by asking questions about the phenomenon, you can meaningfully discuss the conditions of possibility to make the phenomenon manifest whatever way, right? And then you can from there try to ask, what must the cognito be like in order to so be capable of apprehending reality? And you start trying to make meaningful claims about it, and so on and so forth. But whatever conclusions you arrive at will necessarily be one in language and thought, and therefore in structure, And therefore, Derrida would say fall into the problem of presence, to endless deference. Because however you define the structure, you don't know that that's the only way to define the structure. And the only way to know that would be to directly access the cognito, or to know the format of the cognito in all possible worlds. And therefore, you can't necessarily arrive at certainty or any sort of conclusions about the cognito that you could be confident you had accurately made presence. It would always be deferred, whatever you were arriving at. So basically, the idea of a study of the phenomenon being a way to get to the things in themselves, right? Because that's what Husserl was kind of famous for. We're going to get to the things themselves. It was the idea that if we really, really understood how the thing manifests through a kind of bracketing, we could basically determine what those conditions could be, not be, and kind of go more and more, closer and closer, right? But the problem is, as you go closer and closer, you have to think about those very bracketings. And the moment you think about them, you're interpreting them. And once you interpret them, you then have the problem of deference, right? And so this is an issue. Now, at the same time, phenomenology seems to be getting at something very important. The question becomes, what leads? Does the cognito lead, or does the strike of the phenomenon lead? And what does the investigation have you do? Because like when we talk about in a philosophy glimmers phenomenology, we're very interested. We'll talk about the phenomenology of quote unquote lack, a present absence. So for example, if I want a cheeseburger right now, a cheeseburger is not nothing. A cheeseburger is lacking because I want it, right? So, of course, the question becomes, well, what must the conditions of reality be like so that it's possible for me to experience something here that's not here at the same time? We become very interested. I'm of the opinion that using phenomenology on presence, on things, it doesn't work. You get trouble, right? But if you use phenomenology to ask the conditions of possibility, by what must reality be like so that we can be oriented toward things that are not here? Like, and how must our subjectivity be structured to be toward things that are not present? Like a cheeseburger is not here. And yet when I want a cheeseburger, it affects me. How I carry myself in the world changes, right? But that's very strange. So a cheeseburger that I want is not nothing, it's lacking. So what is the phenomenology of lack? And lack is not necessarily a negative term. We don't necessarily mean it in a bad sense. It can mean many things. It can be in a psychoanalytical sense, but it also can be an apophatic sense. It can be in the sense of a mystery. Like, what is the phenomenology of a mystery? That of which you come to know, you find there's more to know. The key, and you've already said it, phenomenology has to be a study of how subjectivity, in my opinion, phenomenology has to be a study of the very fact that reality has a kind of wooing call and response structure to it, to use language that Rothbard has used, right? Like reality seems to call and respond, right? And you see the problem that happens when you study, say, a mailbox, is you lose the call and response, and you assume the way by which you assume the orientation by which you should have to that phenomenon that has unveiled itself to you, which is more of an investigation, of a study. I will now mentally and rationally sort of think through what the conditions of possibility must be like for a mailbox to be great, right? But instead, really, what you should be asking is, okay, I want a cheeseburger and it's not here. What exactly does that mean I now will do? I'm going to go walk to the refrigerator. I'm going to imagine the refrigerator. I find myself moved by reality, right? And you see, the problem is as well for me, is that when you use phenomenology on a mailbox, you're typically not moved by the mailbox. Like, that's the problem. So this is my point. The phenomenon that we care about have a lack quality to them. So if you use phenomenology toward things we don't care about, then you're acting as if the care is not part of the ontology. You're bracketing out the care. When I would argue that Heidegger is correct, that care is ontological. So you have to have phenomenology based on phenomenon you care about, or the ontological investigation assumes care is not part of being itself, which is an assumption. What's that assumption based on? And seeing as the way subjectivity carries itself in the world all day long is relative toward cares, then that should be what the phenomenon is toward. But here's the trick. To increase the probability of the investigation being valid and not falling into the problem of presence, then you want to have a phenomenology of lack, because lack is care. You care about lack. That's the difference between nothing and lack. When a cheeseburger's not here and I don't want it, it's nothing. When a cheeseburger's not here and I want it, it's lacking because I care. That is what phenomenology should be based on. That moment of lack. That moment of when you have that strike of beauty, the mystical vision, and then it's gone. Well, what was this glimmer? What was this glimpse? What was this thing that's now structuring my way in the world, even when it's not present? And what must the conditions of reality be like so that human subjectivity is primarily structured by lack, not by being, and not by nothing? We are primarily structured by lack. So for me, I guess what I want to say is phenomenology, in many respects, and then I'll throw it to you, has been misguided because it's mostly been based on the wrong metaphysic. It's been on a metaphysic that doesn't include the ontological category of lack, which then brings in care, it brings in desire, it brings in mystery, it brings in beauty. In fact, we were speaking about analogy, like the phenomenology of the anagon, the phenomenology of the fifth, the analogical conclusion, where you grasp something and it's pulling you along, you respond to it, and what must the conditions of reality be like to pull you so along? We'll basically ask phenomenology about the word cat, right? Like what that would be the Derrida. Phenomenology, let's put it this way. Phenomenology has often been in service of the word cat, as opposed to the analogical statement, the light is healthy, right? Like phenomenology needs to be toward the anagon, analogical reasoning, because what happens in the anagon, when I say the light is healthy, then it's a space you enter. It's a space you enter and explore, right? And you're trying, and yet you go nowhere. You're here and not here at the same time, right? When I say the word cat, it's a definition you make present and you don't think about it anymore, right? But my point is that human subject. So and I'll finish the point. Human subjectivity. You could even say the cognito if you want, although I think that's a problematic category because it does. But anyway, the cognito does not carry itself through the world in relation to phenomenon according to words like cat. It doesn't think about them. It comprehends them and moves on, right? We carry ourselves in the world looking for and according to spaces that we explore that is more like the phrase, the light is healthy, where we have a sense of what it means, but not entirely. That's why we care to look more and we deepen ourselves and we kind of grope around to explore, right? Subjectivity is formed primarily in anagons, but if phenomenology is going to be about the cognito, it should be about the primary way human subjectivity is used in service of, right? But it hasn't been. It's been used in service of definitions in the word cat in stable states, when that's not how we carry ourselves in the world. Therefore, it has not been used profitably in the way that it should. And that gets into stuff where I like to talk about the phenomenology of the artist, not the phenomenology of an abstract cognito. But what is it like to write a story? The story's here and not here at the same time. You get inspiration for a poem and it goes. What is the nature of experience in the creative act? And what are the conditions of possibility that afford that creative act? Well, now we have an adventure. Now we have a response. So to me, everything you've said on phenomenology, there's almost for me a kind of tragedy in some respects of the field of phenomenology, because it has been used in service of stable metaphysics to get at a cognito that when that cognito is actually in the world, it is never structured toward stable metaphysics. It's always structured relative to lacks and wooing and response. And that's what the question of phenomenon should be based about, because the phenomenon we even care to ask about are the ones we care about. And those tend to be in a structure of call and response. But I'll throw it back to you.
Marvelous. Daniel, thank you for laying it out the way you did. You allowed me to see something from the other side that I did not see before you said it, the way you said it. So thank you. Thank you. Because I was stuck. I was hanging from the sides of the hat on the coat rack, dangling onto presence. When if I would have let go, I would have found that there was ground, hitherto thought absent. And it was absent until I let go. Right? We care about weighty things, and we care about everything around the weighty thing. We care about paradox as well. And those things partake in presence and absent relations, presence, absence. Now, lest Matt Allison think that this is some spontaneous improv of the cogito, and I'm just thinking between concepts, taking my time, I have to disabuse myself of such presuppositions one step at a time. My first step would be, and who knows how many there are, but I won't say them all. I won't even try to, I suppose. It's a lifelong journey, right? But what comes to my mind based on what you said is the parable of the soils canvases this to my mind, what you're saying, i.e. a phenomenology of the, that is to say, a phenomenology of lack. And that is to say, what motivates parts of that parable, I think, can be explained in terms of what you're saying with respect to the phenomenology of lack. But before I go there, the part in Genesis where we read Adam named the animals, and what he named them, that was their name. And God watched, observed to see what he would name them. Now we know the animals existed prior to the naming of them by Adam, because it says God brought them to him to see what he would name them. So God made all the animals come to be. And then brought them to Adam to name them. Now, before God brought the animals to Adam, he did a number of things before the dry land appeared, right? He said, let there be, and there was light. And he named it. So God brings things into being and names them after seeing that they are good, or rather names them and then sees that the act is good. I don't know how to parse it at this moment. But with Adam, who is made, Adam and Eve made together in the image of God, we have a community. We have this opening of space, this giving of space, canonically. God didn't name the animals, but he could have. He named the stars. He named the light. He named the waters. He named his acts. But when the animals came out, he gave Adam that task or that part. He gave him, if I may use a more homely phrase, he gave him a doing that before God had done for other things. So the giving of Adam that doing and watching Adam do that thing was not giving him a constitutive doing, because in naming the animal, he didn't create the animal. But it was still a doing that had such a similar effect that the afterwards, in naming them, the name followed the animal so closely that it was the animal. And notice I'm using the past tense. It's so, in my mind, beautiful, a saying and not saying that Adam created the animals. He didn't create them, he named them. But the names follow the animals so closely that that is their name. But he didn't make them. And yet, and yet, you see this relationship between God and his image is such a mystery, such a caring disposal that this language of lack seems to work. Before I go into the parable of soils, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I think that's a fantastic example because so not to jump to too many points, but for me, lack, the root, anagon, these all things go together. Like the root of which makes it possible to say the light is healthy and that be intelligible to you. And I'm just using that example this evening. So the light is healthy. What makes that intelligible is lacking, but it's not nothing because it affords intelligibility. But if you were to try to say to me how it does, it becomes very difficult. And yet you do it without even blinking. You do it without even blinking. All day long, we make life intelligible in ways and by ways that if asked about directly, we can't explain. We can't make them present. Is that because we're stupid? Or is that because they are lacking ontologically? That's actually the very inability to say entirely what they are is in a way to accurately represent them because they are things that are present and absence at the same time. You can't entirely bring them into presence because they are that of which are known not by defining but by following, right? Like we have a tendency to bias things as true, that which we can entirely define. That underlying assumption of epistemology, of much epistemology, is itself the mistake. There are things you can only know by following. And to say that's less than entirely defining them is to assume a metaphysical assumption. It's to assume a presupposition that all things can be known by definition and that there aren't things that can only be known by following. But of course, we all know that the word basketball is in a sense less than playing the game basketball, right? Like we all know that words are not the same as the experience of it, right? So basically, the point I'm getting at is that definitions are for the sake of following, not definition or versus following. Presence is the reason why presence matters is precisely to, in a sense, lead us toward the lack. So definitions are for following things. Likewise, phenomenon are for following something, not to make it present. Likewise, definition, syntax, the structure is for affording something that you experience. So the language, like the definition of the word health, the definition of the word light, are needed so that I can say the phrase, the light is healthy, and that make possible an intelligibility you follow, and yet that intelligibility, that anagon itself, you can't define like you can the words health or the words machine, right? So the definitions are to afford just like the box growing the strawberries, the definitions are to afford the possibility of the mystery that then you follow. And the greatest truth, like the highest form of truth, is the followed truth. Basically, is what we're getting at, because it's the absolute versus just the stagnancy, right? So the reason why I say that is also when you grasp an anagon, when you grasp a lack, then it has a retrospective impact of being always already. It was always already meaningful, but you didn't get it till this moment in time. You grasp the beginning at this moment of time. So likewise, when Adam names the animal, which is absolutely an event of lack, like the animals were lacking their names, but once you said to them, the lack was always already there. The key to lack is it was always there, right? It's not like you add the lack. The lack was always there, but it was in a sense, it was not unveiled. It was not realized. It wasn't drawn out. The key is that lack is something you draw out. And there's something about names that draw out that of which makes intelligible or brings into awareness what was always already there, right? And basically, here's the issue. I think a whole lot of what it means to be Stuart, got Stuarts in the garden, or what it means to be human. There's something about humans that are strongly in the business of drawing out the always already. Like God creates everything, but not everything is drawn out equally. So it's not that we create anything, because only God creates things, but we do have agency on what of all things created can be drawn out and then uniquely combined with the other things drawn out, right? And that a lot of what it means to relate to phenomenon is this drawing out, this grasping of the anagon, this realizing, this naming, right? So, in my opinion, lack, if you grant that category, which I mean in this very expansive sense, basically all metaphysics, all philosophy, all theology, especially phenomenology, should be based on this experience of lack, because we do not make phenomenon present. That's not what we do. What we do is relate to them to follow them. We relate to them enough to apprehend a lack that then we pursue on. And that should be by which it is that experience that you focus on in order to grasp exactly what it is to speak of subjectivity and what to think of the thing in themselves per se, right? So to me, so I think it's a wonderful example. So those were some thoughts.
And to your point, in using definitions for the following, and not using following as a means of arriving at definitions.
Correct.
As a signal to stop. Equilateral triangle made. Book is down. High fives going on. Party, 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 because tomorrow we become dust, right? There's nothing more beyond this. We found it. We found the eternity, and now the eternity's passed, because that's a now in a frame that's frozen. I can't, you only have one privileged moment into a perfect point.
Yeah.
Then you're on the other side of it. How do you go back? So it's, what am I saying? I don't know what I'm saying. But at any rate, I was excited by what you said, that turn of phrase. We have definitions in order to follow along, but that following along does not know to stop when we come to some definition. How do we know when to stop? Well, that's where care can exert some pressure. The cares of this world have a certain following to them. If I don't follow along with my tax report, I'm not going to pay my taxes on time. There is pressure in the world. There are worldly cares. If I walk outside and see one of my 4 tires are punctured and try to drive, I will be disciplined by the pressure of trying to follow what would have me follow a different route, namely to make a phone call to a mechanic. So we're always following. We're leaving definitions behind, going after another. We're between definitions, and this is what constitutes the interesting, right? The between essences, between definitions. What makes things interesting is that following between definitions, right? This is the source of our feeling, our aboutness, to use the Heideggerian parlance. Our aboutness and everydayness is concerned with. All right. Presence is not given along the way, but something like a promise is. This call and response, this betokening, this invitation. And what made me smile so wide and move my shoulders as you were speaking was, this is how the nations can follow in the footsteps of Abraham. This is how the nations follow in the footsteps of Abraham. Because what was Abraham given to know? That if he left, what does it even mean to leave in this case? If he would accept lack in the familiar, which is to say, one can read the narrative of Abraham and see this perhaps. What I'm saying is, if you accept the lack, and here, go to a land that I will show you, which isn't to say where it is, but it is to be given a promise that the seeing of will be given by the one making the promise if I receive this word now as down payment for that experience and, frankly, that togetherness, because when he shows it to me, he'll be there. So he's already here giving me the word of promise, and he says in that word of promise, he will be there when I arrive. Problem is, if you want to call it a problem, I don't know where it is. So it seems to be a lack. I don't know where the destination is. How can I, and here's the key, begin? How can I begin if I don't know where I'm going? I can never get started. Therefore, I'm never making progress towards it. Therefore, it never is going to happen. I can't even begin to make it happen. How can it even happen if I don't even know how to begin making it happen? You're not even telling me to, frankly, wander, because I know how to wander. I know how to wander aimlessly. I've done it so many times. but there's so many variations on that theme from Matthew Allison. But he didn't tell him to wander aimlessly. He told him to go to a land that I will show you. Accept the lack and I will give you presence. Well, I don't know how to begin that. And in that paradox of there being no gap between promise and fulfillment, because I'm not even beginning to walk in the promise because I don't know where to go with my first step, there is this gap, but also not a gap. Because what connects? The one that says, accept the lack, is also the one that says, to a land that I will show you. So the one that starts it and the one that brings the following to its end is the same, who underneath this promise, underwriting it, is telling you, I will be with you. That brings stasis and kinesis together, and I don't know where the one begins and ends. But what it succeeds in doing is continuing the conversation between God and Moses. Who do I tell them that you are? What is your name? Right? And he gives him a name, but he gives him a name that I will be where I will be. I am the one, the existing one. Right? The one already present, to use your language. And once you have the name already there, captured in what we even think we mean when we say existence. And yet it has to be brought back to them in Egypt. There has to be this journey, this movement. There has to be okay, if I drop the staff, it'll become the snake again. And then I'll be able to pick it up and it will become a staff again. I'll be able to fall down and get up again. But you don't know until you do it, and you don't know how to begin doing it. Because strangely, it's the same, but not. So there's nothing to fall back on. There's only that being with, which is underwriting everything, which is the currency of every doing. But we can't access it as this pop, this point, this dimensionless insight. We can't access it from nowhere and call it presence, because of this beautiful fact from our Creator that life goes on, that we really have a life, that we are real, that it goes on. Even in the cognition's attempt to stop everything and break through, as Ahab said, to break through the mask, life goes on and doesn't let such abstraction take place. And that promise of I will be with you even unto the end of the ages that he gave to his disciples as they went out to the nations, continuing this Abrahamic faith. Dissemination is the wrong word, but it brings us back to the parable of the soils. In that seed is everything. And if one wanted to abstract, they'd say, well, I don't even need it to grow. It's just there. But why do we care about that parable of the soils? Presumably, because at the end of it, we want the fruit, we want the yield, we want the crop, we want to eat something, we want to survive. We want life to go on. So we want a high yield. That finally, to go back to that post office box, what we care about is if there's mail inside for me.
Exactly. Yep.
Is that love letter there from my wife? Is it there? I want to read it. I need to go check the mailbox because I want the letter. I want the communication. I want the response. And it matters if it's not. And if it's not there, I will wait. Because even in that lack, the being with closes the gap and makes my existence transparent to me, not from my cognition to access this transparency, but it gives my spirit movement. It gives me a motivation, even if that motivation is standing still another day to go check the mailbox for tomorrow.
Everything you just said is a very big deal. And I don't know where the time goes. Phenomenology should basically be based on that. Everything you just said. And phenomenology has been based on present. So another way to put it, Plato always has that question of how do you look for something that you don't know what you're looking for, right? That question is what subject, the question of the human, what is the human should be based on. You know, some people call it the sacred romance, you know, Abraham. And you see Heidegger kind of was like, we should base subjectivity, this is very general, the early Heidegger, on death and the fact that we're always already in a project, right? For me, this was close, but a bit of a mistake that I think the later Heidegger started to realize when he talks more, as Luber will say, theme, because it is not merely project that structures subjectivity. It is the work of finding this thing that I don't know what I'm looking for, this particular project that we really need to focus on. And it is in the mode of that sacred romance, I like to call it, that particular project, that you need to engage in phenomenology, not in the stable present. How does the phenomenon manifest to you when it's not there, but it gives hints of itself along the way through other things that make you ready to recognize it when you see it, right? So that, like, the idea that phenomenology is about getting to the thing itself, like and I can pick a thing like a mailbox and I'm going to get to the thing itself. No, because you're in the driver's seat. You will get to the thing that you're looking for and don't know what it is, but not the thing itself of the mailbox. The mailbox might help you get to it might be where the love letter is. Like every possible phenomenon could be road signs all in the following. But to pick a random thing and to treat it as the subject of the phenomenological analysis, the primary subject, is to treat the words health and light and their definitions as primary versus the light is healthy, the following that sends off, right? So to me, the major question is how does something strike us as intelligible when we don't know what it is? And the example that I make based on like Cardinal Newman on the Sacred Romance, and I think it does absolutely tie to the root, the rhizome, the anagon, because this anagon is this thing we follow. Like we follow, like when you get an analogical reasoning, it's not a clear definition. It has a certain fuzziness to it. So you have to meditate on it. You have to follow it. You have to let the thing teach you, right? So likewise, when you're searching for something that you don't know what it is, which I think is what the artist does when they write a story, they know and they don't know what it is. They're writing and they recognize it when it's there. The painter, the lover, all of these people have a mode of subjectivity that is searching for something that they don't know what it is, and yet somehow they recognize it. Like that is like the anagon, that is a metaphysics of lack, and that is what we all long to structure our subjectivity according to. And and you simply have to make this move. If we long to structure our subjectivity according to that, maybe that's because there's a sense where the cognito knows it can't even be itself except in that relationship, right? Like we kind of assume the cognito is indifferent to whatever it is toward, like that it has the same kind of functionality. But we all know that, you know, if I put a car in the water, it wouldn't be a boat. Like there's a certain tilo, there's a certain thing that brings out what a car is, right? I would make the argument that the cognito, which again is a term I don't normally use because I have problems with it, but granting it here, I would argue the cognito is a thing that can't even be itself, to thus ask meaningful questions about it, except in light of this search for something that it doesn't know what it's searching for, that it grasps by one analogical principle at a time. And the example of it, of the sacred romance, kind of based on Cardinal Newman, is the idea that you read Shakespeare, you don't understand a word of it, and yet you're moved by it. How's that possible? How can you be moved by something when you don't understand a word of it? It happens all the time. People are moved by things all the time without understanding it. So well, how's that possible? It's not present, and yet they're moved. Something moves them precisely because it's not present. And that's why it's able to actually strike them on a deeper level. So then you have this experience of being moved that for some strange reason sends you out to take a walk in the woods. So you're walking in the woods and you look up at the branch as it's silhouetted against the full moon. And that feeling of reading Shakespeare somehow connects, and you know it, with the feeling that you have looking at this branch of the moon. And that feeling reminds you of your mother. So then you go see your mom. And when you see your mom, she's in a bad mood. And you don't get that feeling at all. And yet you sense that you should have. But why wasn't it there? So then you go on an investigation to see what exactly creates that feeling that you had when you were a kid. Was it real, or was it actually a feeling that was leading you to something else? And then maybe you go to church, maybe you go to the Bible, and then you say, oh, this is actually what that feeling was being oriented toward. And then that sends you back to Shakespeare. None of that is clear logic of cause and effect. And yet there's a very clear cause and effect in there, following the anagon, following the lack, following this thing that moves you that you don't understand. That is what phenomenology should have been based on, in my opinion. That lack that moves you. And the question then should be the following: what are the conditions of possibility that must be present in reality so that I can have an experience of being moved meaningfully without fully understanding, that makes there be a rhizomatic, meaningful connection between Shakespeare, branch and words, mom, church? And how is it that that forms my subjectivity in a way that without I can't be fully human? And what must reality be like for that to be thus, right? This is the proper, in my opinion, analysis of phenomenology, that because it was too bent on being a science, it wanted to be a science. And because it wanted to be a science, it wanted to be non-contingent, it wanted to be indifferent to the observer, and it wanted to be verifiable. As a result, it assumed a metaphysic that I think got it locked into a game of presence that it had no reason to engage with, and as a result, wasted its time. But there certainly is a place to ask, what must reality be like if it can unveil itself to me in a way that sends me on a search to find something that I don't know what it is, and yet as I search for it, it's intelligible to me what I'm doing, and it actually trains me to recognize the thing when I see it. I just have to have the trust to follow from the definition, not seek the definition. And that ever movement is, I think, well, the movement of eternity.
Oh, thank you for putting forward what you put forward. So to your points, I would then ask us the question so that we can do more following with the time we have. And this comes into play any time we start with a premise, we let it stretch its legs, we let it do some push-ups. It tells us it wants to go serve in the army. We say, wow, you've come a long way. You're so noble. You're willing to stretch forth your arm for others. this premise of mine, right? You're so encompassing of the data. And at that moment, then we say, I've seen where this was going in the past, but now I can see with a slight modification, it will go in this completely new direction. And what we thought was going to be someone living out their life in the gym is now someone serving at the head of a ship, defending their country. Or instead of defending their country, they are writing a book that's going to cover the long lost history of a people that will benefit mankind. However, you want to think about this movement away from, well, they were disciplined in a small room with things heavier than they were. At that moment, though, when we can see how it can go in so many different directions with small modifications, this insight of ours, we then have to ask, how do we importantly fail and not succeed in simply living out the consequences of our own mind? How do we importantly fail to do any of those things? Because we'll want to do that in order to preserve this very thing we've taken the time to care about, which is lack. How do we ensure we can continue to lack now that we are aware of lack?
Yep.
So we have to make another self-reflective movement which incorporates the lack without explaining it away. Exactly. So that we can see it in advance. I think as a gesture towards an answer or a response to this new problem, that what we will want to do is figure out how to supplicate, what to do with complaints, because the Psalms are full of them. Literature is full of it, right? Tragedy is just an answer to complaining. The worst of all things could happen. It happened, the end. No one saw it coming. But I'm talking about in the middle of things, when we're aware of lack, and maybe even it's a tragedy of seeing in advance the lack, which is and that's what tragedy is, right? It's a presence that you could not avoid, even when it was not there. So it's involving time to bring presence into, cramming it into that whole, both HOLE and WHOLE of absence. Tragedies are quite geometric. They're very formal, and hence they're not livable. Nobody lives in a tragedy, not only within as content, but if Matt Allison was to try to apply a tragedy to his life, the structure thereof, the most I could do is agree with it sentimentally, right? Oh, right. This thing happened to me, that thing happened to me. I felt bad. I lost this. I lost that. Even terrible things. Still, life goes on. We say, and I know it's so dry and proverbial, but since it does, we don't even find the means of living according to a tragedy, structurally speaking. And so, of all storytelling devices, the tragedy is the furthest, in my mind, removed from human life, even though on the surface of things, it seems to be so apt. But structurally, there is no humanity in a tragedy. There is no living with the lack. It's constant presence down the throat.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so there's no room for any of the things that we actually experience as spiritual beings, namely anticipation, unknowingness, caring in the midst of that unknowingness, boredom and tedium, and sometimes even at the most climactic moments of our life, we still notice that fly buzzing by and being like, oh. Like that doesn't belong, strictly speaking, in the most important moments of our lives. And yet we do. We just start stare at the pole. Whoa. at the most important moments of our lives. Tragedy doesn't account for that, structurally speaking. So what do we do with, now that we've articulated the lack, how do we keep our investigations fresh, knowing this?
Absolutely magnificent. This is very important because if lack becomes a presence, then it's merely a word of self-deception. Like, how does lack stay lacking and thus a cause of following, right? What it would mean is that lack, so there's a few things. First, it should be noted that lack can't be constant, because if it was constant, then it wouldn't be lacking. It would be always there. So it has to have this coming and going sort of structure to it, right? I think, again, it's interesting because that makes me think of the strawberries, because they come and go. There's a structure that affords them to come and go, right? But they come and go on their terms, and therefore you can never bring them into full presence, right? And I actually do think what I'm alluding to is, I actually think lack has something to do with how we experience eternity necessarily. That keeps eternity unveiling, it keeps it new, it keeps it alive, it keeps it dynamic. Like, perhaps God experiences eternity as this constant, and that could be a characteristic of what makes God God. But because God is a Trinity, even that has a dymorphism to it, but that would get us into that topic. But eternity for the human being has this characteristic of coming and going, but it is nevertheless eternal, because it turns out the coming and going is the very thing that structures our subjectivity to be able to handle eternity. Because the thing that we're getting at is that lack structures subjectivity. Without lack, we don't form properly, right? And there's something about lack that actually teaches us to want eternity and structures us and trains us to handle more and more eternity as well, right? So it's a training. There's lack entails training. There's a training to it. And lack in this life is training for the next, and so on and so forth. Now, all that has to be expanded on. But the point is that strawberries can be put in a structure and still be lacking. So it is not impossible necessarily that being intentional about lack will necessarily make the mistake of presence, right? Because it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. It is theoretically possible to have structure that nevertheless makes us more intentional and toward lack without turning it into presence. So the questions become, how does one do this? Well, a big one, we'll talk a lot about encounters, encounterology, surprise. Like, why is it that love your neighbor as yourself is such a big deal? Because the neighbor is always surprising you. You're always lacking the other. You never become the other. The other is an infinite source of surprise. Even if you know they're there, you don't know what they're going to say. Even if you know they're right there, like, the strawberries grow here, but you don't know when. Like, the other is a structure of constant lack, because you never inhabit their consciousness. You can never make them fully present. But then that also affords the possibility of romance and intimacy, because it's precisely that you never entirely know your spouse, that then you have a lifetime together of greater and greater depths, right? So in this way, lack becomes a structure of eternity that is a blessed thing, right? But the other becomes an opportunity for lack. But here's the problem. Because we're often caught in chit-chat, as Heidegger said, or we're mindless, we don't often, in a sense, dig into or mine the fullness of lack that the other can afford, right? So we have to do a lot of work to actually let the other come forth in their fullness as other, so that the lack can strike forth and structure our subjectivity in a new way. Well, that means we have to overcome assumptions. We have to train ourselves to be able to converse. We have to be not short-tempered. We have to do all the stuff Jesus says. Like, if you follow Jesus's teaching, the other can become, there's a higher probability that the other can become a source of lack in a way that structures you, like the Shakespeare sonnet, toward into the sacred romance. Right? So if you follow Jesus's teaching, it increases the probability that the other directs you toward the sacred romance. It also means the other might turn into the people that crucify you, right? But that's also part of the sacred romance, though. The very fact that, being like Jesus brings out the worst in people, because actually joy judges. Like, when people encounter joy, they tend to hate it because it brings out everything. That nevertheless is actually part of the development. That's part of the movement. And so, there are things on how to make lack be lack without making it presence that is tied into how we relate to other people. if we put ourselves in environments where we can be surprised. I think there's a lot to be said about thinking in terms. Michelle and I were just talking today about thinking in terms of environments, not just like willpower, right? Like, you know, it would have to be expanded upon, but we were talking a bit about how you can just mysteriously have energy. You know, I actually think there's a whole secret world. I think it's tied to the spirit on how energy is not simply something you get because you go to bed. Like you go to bed and then you get a lot of energy, and the day is a process of running out of energy. It seems to be possible to suddenly have energy appear out of nowhere suddenly, and it's like mysterious how it happens. Like, and then time flies. You don't know where the hours go, such as talking with you. Our world all around us is filled with mysterious energy that actually is lacking. It's present and absent at the same time, but we don't know how to create the syntax, quote unquote, or the conditions to unlock it. So if you realize this, for as an example, Michelle and I were just making a funny example of, so you got that chair in the living room that you haven't like touched in years. Literally picking up that chair and putting it in a new location suddenly can like inspire you, right? Like changing things in the environment, right? Like adding these lights in the garage, bam, or changing how you talk. Just adding like the meta environment of conversation, like adding jokes, adding wit, suddenly you're more energized in conversations. These things come up. The reason why energy as such and lack are tied together, because that energy, that potential for that energy was always already there. It was just lacking. It was a present absence that you didn't meet the conditions to bring out. And as you bring out those conditions, it creates the energy to actually seek more of it and more of it and more of it and more of it. But what ends up happening then is the whole world around you has this potential coming forthness of life, but you don't know exactly how. So every room, every individual becomes a kind of mystery. It becomes a kind of exploration to bring out this energy, to bring out this thing that was always already there, like the names of the animal. But you see, you don't know how, and when you do it, it comes and then it's gone again. That structure of the subject, in of themselves and toward the world, keeps lacking and doesn't make it a presence because you're not in control. That's kind of the key. Lack stays lack if you're not in control. If you come to be in control, you can systemize it. You can make a science of it. You can make a kind of program. Then lack is a presence. And ultimately, that's the mistake, I think, that phenomenology, as we've traditionally known it, does. It makes us in control of the phenomenon, ultimately. It makes us decide the way that the phenomenon will serve us. We decide the goals that we are seeking in phenomenon versus let the phenomenon unveil to us what our goals should be. And instead of letting the phenomenon lead by which we follow, right? So I think there are habits and orientations and ways of being that can keep lacking and not as a presence, and thus structure us properly in our encounter with them as we ought to be so structured as subjects that want to be human. And it has a lot to do with encounters, has a lot to do with surprises. It has a lot to do, yeah, I guess the final thing I'll say, and then throw it back to you, is there's always that idea of, Jesus sits with sinners, right? And there's sometimes where you hear that, and I think the Christian can kind of take that as a certain charity. Oh, Jesus was being charitable. He was being kind of very nice to sit down with sinners. There's another, which of course is true, but there's another sense in which the Christian can't actually be Christian unless they're around other people. That actually your Christianity doesn't become itself unless you quote unquote sit with sinners. Because if you're not willing to sit with sinners, that means you probably have pride, or you think you're better than, or you're mostly what happens is people are afraid of being seen by their neighbors or family as sitting with sinners. So they have an image they want to preserve, right? So if in a sense you can't be Christian if you have an image you want to preserve, like, because I think that's what often happens. People don't want to be seen sitting with sinners because they don't want to have their image tarnished, right? Well, if being Christian requires you to kill your idols, which your image of yourself is one of them, then you literally need, in a sense, sinners in order to be Christian, because you need them to be there so you can sit with them to kill your image, right? To kill how people see you, right? And the reason why I bring this up is because that need of the other person to bring something out, that you cannot provide yourself is precisely the dynamic of lack that we're describing. Like, if lack is made present, it doesn't work, but we can put ourselves in environments where we let it unveil itself to us. And I think you see that modeled in Jesus. So those were just some thoughts on this fine evening, my friend. And I think that issue of keeping lack is actually a very, very important one.
I'm so grateful for the illustrations you brought up because they set my mind racing. I had to plug my laptop in, otherwise it would have died. So thank you. Forgive me for all the shifting as you were speaking, but I was hearing every word. I think you're right on the money. You hit the nail on the head when you bring up the feast our Lord had with the tax collector and sinners. And I agree with you. The first impulse should not be, I think, oh, what an act of superlative politeness.
Right.
A person who's a nice guy will help those around if he can, when he can, as he should. But notice it's as he should.
Right.
There's no freedom there. A robot could do that, made to order. It just has to be given the parameters. A Boolean logic might do. Just has to look for some external traits, attributes, and counterfactuals, and it can steer its self-driving car to deliver niceness and pleasantness and rubbing of elbows at will. But what we find in his sitting there at the table was freedom.
Yep.
And to the point of our discussion, a freedom that took up residence in the lack. For what does he say? It is not those who are well who are in need of a physician, but those who are sick. We could look at the phenomenology of sickness, which is a map of the lack. But notice it's not a map of X marks the spot. It's a map of sliding topographies that are interacting with each other and are giving real-time updates, similar to people seated at a table talking while they're eating, having side conversations. And some who are talking one to another can look with their eyes, even as they're talking to the one over here, can look at their eyes over there and think they are seeing the lips of the other person over there say their name. Oh, I've been named in that conversation over there. I wonder what they're talking about saying my name. The kidney says to the heart, says to the brain, and the spine down the middle is also wondering what's going on in here. Was that itch more than an itch? So the body, as a metaphor for different people at table eating and forming a community, and in community, all these side conversations have a part to play. And there is speaking over, there is speaking under, there is sometimes speaking directly to. That as map, a dynamic map of this lack, suffusing, perfuming the presence, and that complex being that which is addressed by the physician brings this home. And that being his deliberate choice, that being the other he chooses to go to as neighbor, and caring, loving. Now we can ask, where does this organ come from that allows us to appreciate lack not as nothing? Chapter 1 of Genesis, the first few sentences, it's not a vacuum. It's an abyss of ocean, water, darkness over the deep. It's everything I could think of as not being a beautiful garden on a mountain or excuse me, a beautiful garden by a mountain receiving water from the mountain that animals are docile in and there's food to eat. It's the opposite of that, but it's not nothing. It's the opposite. It's the unstructured potential that it came from, but it wasn't announcing itself. It was collecting taxes. And then the logos passed by and said, follow me. And it became far more than it was by following. Now, to your point of the Shakespeare, the walk in the woods, the conversation with mother, these things don't add up, but I can draw a line between them. That organ of seeing, my goodness, we're made in the image of God. It points us to God. This is the life of God. Mm-hmm. The Holy Trinity, the communion of love, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I often think if I'm sitting on my deck, I don't want to know the answer. What makes the sky the sky? I don't want its composition. Because then what would I do with it? I don't know what to do with information. Almost at all with anything. But sometimes when you're with a family member, someone you love, a friend, and maybe you haven't seen them for a while, and then you do, and you embrace, there's that split second when you hold their back and you squeeze, but you don't really want them to feel it, and you really don't want to feel it, but you're aware that you're giving it that extra, just a little bit, because you don't want anything more. And you know time is going on. But this is, and then you stop because words would then take you into their dictionary definition and bring before you this procession of presence that the embrace has nothing to do with. And where am I going with this? I want to ask you the question of what you make of this people at feast and the body and becoming healthy again through the dynamic our Lord coming to the lack. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. So first, one of the reasons why many philosophers will kind of focus on language or different structures of language is because the idea that basically whatever philosophy of language you have, you can almost structure all intelligibility out of that, right? Like it's all going to be kind of isomorphic to it. So if intelligibility is based on the sentence, then all forms of knowing are based on the sentence, if you will, like definition and so on. So, and what the problem you get with you brought up freedom is the idea that if I say, there's the cat, where's your freedom in that? There's the cat. Okay, you look, you're determined. There's not really, you either don't look or you look. There's not really freedom. But if I say the light is healthy, there's freedom because you have to get in there and explore it, right? This is why the anagon or analogical reasoning is such a big deal, because if actually all language is constantly engaged in an analogical reasoning, which many people point out that when we use words, we don't use definitions. We use likeness constantly, that we reference experience that we're kind of exploring. We do intelligibility by relationality based on experience. We don't summon definitions when you say cat. You summon the experience and you think of the likeness and it becomes a field to occupy. The reason why this is a very big deal is because it actually shows that we are free. Intelligibility is an act of exploration and freedom because it is in lack, right? And so freedom and lack strongly go together. And we are free to the degree that lack is possible. Like if it's pure presence, there's no freedom. It's just pure determination then, right? So the very fact that we can't get presence, which you would say, well, then, there's no truth. one that doesn't follow. No, the impossibility of presence, which is the possibility of following, is freedom. But notice that the following means your freedom can have structure. You're free, but there's something to follow. Therefore, it's not chaos. And so the way we actually gain intelligibility through language is definition to following, which means freedom and order. It's freedom without chaos. Like freedom, what makes freedom freedom and not chaos is that there's a through line. There's something that's leading you along, but you don't know what it is. So that's freedom too, because if you knew entirely what it was, like the structure of freedom is this: I'm looking for something and I don't know what I'm looking for. Like I'm looking for something and I don't. That is the structure of freedom. It almost has to be, because if you knew what you were looking for, then it could just be cause and effect, right? Like it could just be following. It just, you have to do it, right? But if it's this searching around, then that is the very development of freedom. Because what freedom develops, according to, is recognizing what it is as it goes. But since it doesn't know what it is, then it's free because it's discovering it. It's the agency is found in the realization of what that freedom is. That is found in the exploration. So lack and freedom strongly go together. And what's very interesting, as you're saying with Genesis, and this is very important, in the beginning was the lack in this sense, right? It's this present absence. And it would seem as if we have this organ that is from in the beginning. And notice the key you also brought out is that the logos, it brings out, it creates the intelligibility. It comes, the lack, when it meets the logos, then comes into creation. Right? So likewise, we have this lack or we experience lack, which is this sense of a thing that is trying to come to be, right? Like when I read Shakespeare and I don't understand it, there's this feeling of something is trying to come to be. Something is trying to come into being. So then I take a walk in the woods. Then I go see mom. I'm on this path of trying to make something come to be, right? And when you follow the anagon, there's this something coming to be that you're after, right? That is the kind of movement of Genesis. That is from which all things kind of come into creation, that something is coming to be. And what's, I think, very, very interesting as well is on this idea, like Jesus, as you're saying, like follow and you go after. And you also made the point that you really wouldn't care to know what makes the sky blue, right? We do not long for information. We long to follow. We long to follow something and behold something. That's what we want. We want to behold something. Like the coming to be is the coming to the beholding. Like we want to witness something. We want to experience something, right? The reason why we get caught up in information and definitions is because we think that maybe if we look there, we'll find the thing that we want to behold. And the key is we don't know what we want to behold until it appears, right? And since definitions and information can lead to following, then we research this guy and we figure out its composition and we figure out the facts that make it up. But those facts are precisely to follow toward something, not to be the entirety, right? And it's interesting too, like Jesus is like, well, follow. Well, that's the structure of reality. Follow the anagon, follow the lack, follow, and you will gain creation. You will come into be as you do it. You will come into be to behold. Because what we long to behold, we have to come into a certain mode of being to be able to behold it, right? Or else we can't handle it, or we can't even sense it, or we can't experience it, right? And so we have to follow Jesus to come to be. And the thing is that the thing that we want to behold, we can only become the kind of being by which to behold it if we're willing to sacrifice images and how people see us and associations and intelligibility. So you sit down with the quote unquote sinner, because the sinner is a social category that says outcast. And if you don't fit into the social categorization, that yourself, that removes everything within you that longs to, it means you can't make the thing you want to behold be status. The thing you want to behold can't be social acceptance. It can't be the rewards of this world, right? Because the moment you sit down with the sinners, you're disqualifying yourself from those experiences, right? And basically, unless you're willing to be seen with the sinner in this sense, you probably have subconscious pulls in the direction of other things, right? Because you're protecting your image, or you have a sense of who's good and who's wrong. This idea of the thing you need to follow it is actually really, really hard to keep yourself following it because we get our motivations mixed up, because we end up self-deceived, because we do care about how other people see us, and we care how we see ourselves, right? And judgment as such gets in the way of the organ of this lack, its sensibility. Like we don't protect the sensibility. And so you have to do things to basically force yourself full body to give up judgmentalism in yourself and by others, to basically train and to keep alive the sensibility of this organ of Genesis, so that you can continue to follow and be brought into being, so that you can behold the thing that you long to behold and to actually hold it. And this is, and so for me, if there's, and then I'll throw it to you, if there's something about the meaning of life being sainthood, becoming a saint, something of this nature, theosis, et cetera, et cetera. I think the life of the saint, like when you read the lives of the saints, there are all these really idiosyncratic stories, like very unique, very strange. Yeah, there are stories of people reading Shakespeare, then they go see the Brants in the Woods, then they go see their mom, they're following an anagon, they're following a lack that has a through line, but only makes sense to them. And it has to only make sense to them, because otherwise it could be for the world. It could be the status. It has to be this rat. And what they're doing is training this organ, this sensibility, and their whole life is dedicated to keeping that sensibility alive, to find the thing that they don't know what they're looking for. And that is the process of sanctification and sainthood that brings you to the place where you can behold the beatific vision, which is afforded to the saint, which then creates a feedback loop that keeps it alive. So you're training that sensibility and sinning with the saints sent with the sinners. The saints have no problem being with the sinner, because that removes the judgmentalism on all layers of the consciousness, so that the sensibility can stay alive. The following can stay alive. So that's why I think sitting at that table is so important.
Thank you. Yeah, the philosophy since Kant has not wanted to move a finger until it could pronounce
Correct.
to every faculty what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for the possibility of experience. Let us practice our judgment before we have to make judgments that count. As if there could be this sandbox before we have to tie our shoes and walk into the dirty streets of normativity, right? Where the normative judgments move matters and hold sway, and there's a court of public appeal. Before that, can't we just exercise the faculty of judgment? And as it were, every sand in the sandbox can hold eternity, as William Blake might say. But time marches on and life goes on as we're in this fictitious realm of training the judgment. And why risk? This is something I read from Kierkegaard. Why risk the only life we have to practice making judgments for some moment? Rather, as you say with theosis, let us treat this life as practice for more of the same without the pain, the corruption, the temptations. In other words, if there is anything good, lovely, true, or beautiful, meditate on these things as we await the eschaton, as we come to the end of time, as we wait for our Lord and Savior to appear in our communities, in our real relationships that will go on. So I think it is unavoidable that life as we know it, as we are, with this in and out, going in and out, call it chronology, call it successive absences. Either way, we are facing practice. But philosophy since Kant, I would argue, has been construing this practice to mean practice for judgment making.
Yes.
But if we don't start with that prejudgment of our own calling before we're called, and we allow the Lord to have the judgment at the end of time, then suddenly, life becomes beside the point of judgment. What would life be like if I was never asked to make a determinate judgment? Then we have a lack. The mind wants something else to do. Oh, now I notice the mind has an appetite. This organ does not have to make judgments. What then may it do? And so practice. And here, since we brought up theosis, we can also talk about noetic, right? The nous, Greek word for mind. It is all that the nous does. I mean, does the nous only make determinative judgments? I don't think so. Because, as you say, there is this reading and walking and meeting people and noting connections. In other words, there is idiosyncrasy.
Yep.
And I'm not willing to call that fancy. Oh, it's just a fancy in the mind. Time to sit down and make determinative judgments. I'm not willing to be an empiricist or an idealist or analytic and just call it all language games. This is ascetic. This is the ascetic discipline of accepting the fact that the world is full of lack and that it is good.
Yes.
Coming from God, and that how we live with God and with one another, i.e. our neighbor, is, forgive me, I don't have a better word, because it seems to stop when I want to give the impression of going on and on. We have to accept that as a gift and not know with a determinative judgment what that all means and entails. Because we haven't lived it out yet. We are living it out. We are living it out. And the fact that God loves us so much that he's living it out with us, the incarnation of the Logos. It's quite a trip. It's quite a trip.
It is. All that is very well said. So it's very interesting because so much of life, and I think once you get to these major issues, that it comes down to very slight differences and very slight nuances that make all the difference. Like they change everything. So, for example, I think judgment is important to defend the sensibility. We've used judgment to replace the sensibility, right? So, so for example, like lack could lead you into, hell, because I don't, I'm lacking, I'm incomplete, I'm a failure. So the metaphysics of lack could lead to autocannibalism, but it also could lead to the apathetic and mystery, right? So it all depends on your orientation to it, right? God is hell to those who hate him, et cetera, et cetera. There's phenomenology that leads to a doctrine of presence and certainty that's self-destructive, or there's asking about the conditions of possibility that make lack possible in the structuring of subjectivity. So these very small differences make all the difference. And we're kind of in an age where I think, because we're in just the particular moment that we're in, that there's a certain kind of reclaiming or going back and taking these concepts and saying, oh, we use them in the slightly wrong way that ruined everything. So now we have trouble, right? So like, let's take deconstruction. Like the very fact you can't have certainty. To me, the very fact you can't have certainty should have been used on anything that so I'm going to just call this sensibility. We've been talking about the sensibility of lack that structures. I want to say that, and by sensibility, I have in mind this part of you, this organ that you described that keeps you attuned. Aspasy and Seth and I, we've talked about authentic resonance. There's this thing that keeps you attuned to the sacred romance, this associational journey, this thing that is leading you from the branch, Shakespeare, to the branch that's guiding you in theosis, sanctification. So this sensibility is something that you can always doubt. Like the lack of certainty is necessary to have this sensibility, because if you had certainty, you'd make the sensibility present, right? It wouldn't be a sensibility you followed, it would be present. So you can't have certainty precisely to afford this sensibility. But the very fact you can't be certain can also be used by any sort of foxes that come to steal it and say that doesn't exist, or, well, how do you know it does exist? Or you could deconstruction is supposed to be used in service of self-defense. We've used deconstruction as a basis of a worldview when it should be used as self-defense to defend the sensibility. So it goes with judgment. Judgment should be used to defend the sensibility. Like you should use judgment to determine that you need to sit with the sinner, not to judge the sinner as a sinner you do not need. You should be using judgment to precisely to determine that you can't determine yourself without the sensibility. Right? But we've used judgment to replace the sensibility, right? Because you have to make decisions. The problem is we're making decisions in our lives. And I know there can be differences between discernment and judgment, but I'll use them more interchangeably here. But the point is, we tend to make decisions based on a metaphysics of presence. Like what's the best job? What do I need to do? Oh, I judge this person as good or bad. So all of that is a metaphysics of presence. In the same way that phenomenology has been used in service of presence and thus problematic, so judgment has been in service of presence and certainty, when really judgment is supposed to be used in service of determining what you need to do to keep the sensibility alive, what you need to do to keep your freedom going, what you need to do to defend that space of exploration of the anagon, right? And that's where judgment is supposed to be more of what you need to do to keep following, right? Like, because judgment, it's a larger topic. I think we are very confused about judgment because we no longer believe in spiritual warfare. We don't believe that there are things out there to deceive us, right? So judgment should be in service of determining what is deceiving you. And that is deception. Get rid of it. That is not the sensibility. Get rid of it, right? So you're trying to determine, you're not supposed to use determinate judgment to determine what the thing is you're looking for. You're supposed to use determinate judgment to keep away everything that would take you from the seeking of that which you don't know you're seeking until you find it, right? We're using judgment and determination to destroy mystery, and therefore our subjectivity cannot properly form, because human subjectivity is structured by the project of lack, that is the sacred romance, that is the seeking of that which we don't know we're seeking for. And if you use determinate judgment to know the goal of that seeking, then you don't form. You've made yourself entirely present, and theosis is over, because theosis occurs in the ever processing, the eternal, the not fully present, the lacking. It develops as such. So you also brought up the nous. Thomas Jockin, and I completely agree with him. He believes the concept of nous has been woefully misunderstood in classical thought to simply mean determinate judgment. That people think that nous is just knowing in this kind of determinate way. One of the things that Jockin will stress is that nous is living. There's this kind of organic living structure to it. And so Jockin thinks nous has been radically misunderstood. And I think he's correct. Like nous is a living, and he goes into much more on this, but nous is a kind of living apprehension. Like the key concept of nous is how do you tell the difference between something that's alive and not alive, right? Like it's actually quite mysterious because, if you have a dead body, it's not physically any different than an alive body, and yet it's clear as day. And you can tell the difference between alive and dead just like that, right? For Jockin, that is a far better representation of nous than simply calculation or something like that, right? Like nous is the ability to tell life. I think it's also tied to the ability to say that that's harmony, that music goes together, that's fitting, and you just kind of know it, right? You just grasp it. And so, furthermore, nous, I think, is precisely like properly understood only itself in the sensibility of that which leads you on the sacred romance, because the sacred romance also is a feeling of I'm doing that which makes me alive. I'm doing that which makes me alive and also makes the people around me alive as well. And I don't know how it's happening. I just know that if I take the next step of faith, that it somehow has this ability to translate into a giving of the quality of life that is just there. Like you never make it present, but you get it shine. Like another way to look at it, I guess, and then I'll throw it to you. I was speaking with Daniel Coughlin, and we were talking about fire. And the interesting thing about fire is if you throw anything at it, it consumes it and gets rid of it. You tend to know fire. You can tell, though, there's fire by how it illuminates everything around it, right? So you don't look at it directly because it will devour you, let's say, in this example. But you can tell its presence by how it illuminates everything else. That is what theosis and lack does. You can tell that the sacred romance is here, not because you make it entirely present, but because of the way it illuminates everything around it, right? So likewise, when you're properly following that sensibility, you can tell you are by the energy, by the field, by the beauty, by how everything around you is, quote unquote, illuminated, right? But you don't have to make the thing present in the way Derrida is concerned about to know it is there, because you can tell it is there by its illumination. Kind of similar to like where Lewis says, I know the sun is here by how it illuminates everything, not looking at it directly, right? Lack has that category, and therefore we can meaningfully discuss it being here without committing the metaphysical mistake of presence. But having that sensibility of knowing what to do to generate that possibility is what judgment is supposed to serve, not replace. It is what phenomenology is supposed to be mystified by, not bring into a stable certainty that's dead. It is what nous is supposed to be apprehending, not comprehending into something stable. And so I think we are in great need of rethinking all of these philosophical principles in light of the sensibility that would have us follow the sacred romance.
Indeed. And I appreciate the terminology of what you're saying with respect to the sacred romance, because it involves the notion of care. As you said, so much turns on the little differences in what we mean. And I think we are at that stage in the conversation where, as you say, it's judgment, yes and no.
Exactly. Yep.
It becomes, we're at the stage where things become proverbial, as they should, and carry with them a duality, a both and, under conditions necessitating discernment, which requires, as we know it, as anyone would know it, it seems, experience, time behind, or a familiarity with, which might not require too much time behind. Right? If my brother was the Prince of Wales, and I would only have to talk to him once or twice to know a lot more than I ever would if he wasn't my brother. And all I had was a few books at the library about the history of Wales, right? Right? So not everything is dependent on a vast database behind or widely there. It might be simply a relational if then. If he's my brother, then I can know much more than if he's not. And we're saved into a family relationship, right? It's Christians, they don't say they're saved because they know about. They say because they say they're saved because they put on Christ. And are now he is not ashamed to call them brothers, call mankind, call his brothers and sisters brothers and sisters in the Lord. We're saved into a family relation. This is salvation as we know it. It's not a getting the equation right, to your point about calculation. And I think also it's worthy to note, it's not a dialectical turn that we're in media res in the middle of here.
Right.
Because this nous is not learning, processing according to differences. Well, this difference, that difference, ping pong back and forth, plinko now another difference. And now I'm seeing that wealth is poverty, poverty is wealth. So poverty is wealth and wealth is poverty. And then the upshot of that is some kind of transcendent view on extension as such, right? It's not that game. And because that I think you're right with what you say about Derrida, that is a sort of totem pole of a linguistic idol. That is presence as words that refer to other words that are in this chain of words. We just maybe neoplatonically give it a nicer nomenclature that's sounds more sophisticated, has a better ring to it. But, levels of being, well, how is that any different from a series of words claiming presence?
Exactly.
And I think we have to be careful when we talk about journeying on a ascent, because that even seems to say, to the extent that we're distant from the mundane and silhouetted and shadowy, we come closer to the presence of this bright being that how do we know we're not just doing turns of phrases on that navigation? And here I was reading a book on the history of algebra from its Greek roots the other day. Here we can go into the arithmoi, or the arithmetic, and how certain religions and rituals and metaphysical propositions came out of concentrated looking at the structure of counting. Right? When we count something as something and count to a number of some things, what happens when we stop counting and say the number of sheep is 10? What's the difference between that 10th sheep we've counted and the one sheep we've counted, and the one number repeats even though the sheep are different? You know, this relationship between the one and the many here, it's hard as we accumulate differences to not just make it all about differences. So what I'm trying to say is the nous is not just a tutored magnifying glass on differences as such. Right. It can't be, because that would be to make it a taxonomic object of self-reflection, a science, as a cold thing, as an immovable object. And it's, to your point, certainly living by the grace of God. And I mean, without it, I don't know if we would be able to follow any of the commands or hear any of the commands, let alone have this recognition of neighbor. Because it's not a recognition come to through our wise referencing of a myth. It's not certainly Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, But the neighbor as such is not a just so story.
Right.
A day in the life. Well, what's the day? What is the day in the life of the neighbor? That is the mystery. So the nous has this, I mean, like you say, you know, and it's not simply immediate, because that's to my ear,
Right.
it's a Hegelian term, because the immediate is just waiting for the mediate. It's just waiting to find a counterexample, a difference to start to get moving with amongst the differences to generate more differences. So I don't want to say an immediate knowing. It's just simply a gift. Or no, even that, I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know. How do you just, I don't know. But it's wonderful. Thank God.
I love everything you just said, and I have to run as well. To just what you said, um, if all things, so if Hegel, because Hegel makes this very strange move, but if all things are dialectical, meaning they're passing over into otherness, becoming their opposite, but to be dialectical means you're trapped, then then thought needs something that's not a thing. And this is the key move to speculative reason, because and this so things are dialectical, like they're passing over into otherness. Well, if everything is dialectical, then aren't we trapped in the way you just described? Yeah, we are, unless there is a ontological status that is not a thing. That's lack. So the only way you escape dialectics, and again, Hegel's obviously very famous for the dialectics, but then he's showing the movement of the dialectics in the Phenomenology to actually get to this speculative reason that is trying to move beyond thinghood. But there is this kind of idea, and again, it's just something, that I just think is so important, is that lack is how you deal with the problem of dialectics that all things are. But then the question is, what would it then mean to think lack? Because here's the weird move: the things that are dialectical are lacking. So dialectics overlap with lack, but they're not identical in this sense. Like that the lack is not itself dialectical, but it is unveiled in dialectics. And that's always the tricky move, right? But the focus is the lack then, right? Of which you need to go through dialectics to get to, that is in dialectics, but it's not reducible to dialectics. And that's why I just am strongly of the opinion that, in Jockin and Javier, we talk about it a lot, is that one of the main reasons philosophy, metaphysics, theology has suffered is because they have not had the category of lack as a distinct ontological status. They've had being and nothing, but not lack. And lack is critical. Lack is what humans are formed according to and by. So the category of lack has been deeply missing from thought. And I think it has been very, very consequential. So, the lack of lack as a metaphysical category, I think, has been holding back thought big time. And recovering it is a very big deal. And I think when you're focused on lack and the development of lack, then, well, I'll make that point on what you were saying on counting. Like Leibniz is very interested in what's the difference between counting and listing. When I say 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple, I'm judging a quality. I can only count because there's qualities, right? So what exactly, when I say that's an apple and that's an apple, well, at what point does that thing cease being an apple to be included in that set versus not, where there's some sort of lack there that I'm apprehending that's bringing them together to thus count them, as opposed to just list 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just listing numbers. But when I go 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, I'm counting. So counting is metaphysical. Counting is necessarily metaphysical. It necessarily involves quality. It's not merely quantity. And then, of course, I would argue the quality that you're often countering is a certain quality of lack. Because if I say what makes the apple, because substance is like, ultimately, I'm going to say that substance is lack in Aristotle. Like what makes an apple is that it has a particular lack that takes on a particular quality that we apprehend it when we see it. But if you try to define what it is, you can't do it. It's really hard. It's a sympathesis thing, right? So you just have to follow it. You just have to experience it. And that suggests that when we are quantifying and we don't think we're doing anything that involves subjectivity, it is involving subjectivity. That's how you count. And all intelligibility requires subjectivity as such. Therefore, so this is the point. If counting, which is, you could say, the original intellectual act, like it's the first intellectual act, if quality must be present to count, then it's subjectivity all the way down. And then the question is, what structures that subjectivity? It's lack. Lack structures subjectivity. We're perpetually relating with lack. And therefore, phenomenology, theology, philosophy, ethics, everything needs to center on this metaphysical basis, not presence, not absence, not being, not nothing, but lack. And lack also turns being into becoming as well. It's a temporal structure. It's a care structure. It's an entirely different way of being in the world. And then I think what we see in Jesus, and I think as his example, is what does one need to do to keep alive their sensibility of lack? That if we lose, we are no longer properly structured, right? Well, you have to die to yourself. You have to give up status. You have to be seen with the sinner. You have to do things that seem absurd because you want to make sure you're not serving rationality instead of this sensibility. So you have to do things that seem crazy. You have to lay down your life because you need to make sure you're not serving self-preservation instead of this sensibility. All the things that Jesus is teaching you to do become practices that you need to engage with to make sure you're serving this sensibility as opposed to something else. And you're always already in the middle of it. Because I think the other thing is there's this problem of, in order to practice well, you need this thing that you need to practice well to get, right? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, lack as being an always latent present absent solves this problem because it was always there, and everything you did was actually practicing toward this sensibility. You just didn't know until the end, and then that turns out that's always already what you were doing. Like you were always developing this sensibility, even when you didn't know it, because it was latent at all steps of the way. And what we do should serve that. But I will run, Mr. Allison. It is always a pleasure to speak with you, sir. Thank you for your time this evening. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Daniel, thank you. It was so nice to see you.
Thank you, Matthew. It was very nice to see you as well.